Jack Halstead never planned to be anyone's hero, just a delivery man on a rain-slick night, counting the minutes until he'd get home to his daughter. But when he found a fevered little boy shivering alone in the corner of a marble lobby, something in him refused to walk away. Who was this child? And why had no one come for him? The answer would pull Jack into a world he'd never expected and change the course of all their lives. Let's find out in the story. Rain slicked the streets, turning the city into a mirror of fractured lights. The white delivery van rolled through the dim, its wipers thudding in a tired rhythm. Jack Halstead leaned forward over the wheel, eyes narrowing at the blur of the traffic signal ahead, shoulders heavy beneath his canvas jacket. The last drop-off was just 3 blocks away, and his thoughts had already wandered home. Maisie waiting in the small apartment, the smell of reheated stew, her voice telling him about her day with a neighbor. The van hissed to a stop outside the glass doors of the Goldwyn residences, a building that looked more like a bank than a place where people lived. Marble facade, gold trim, the kind of doorman's desk that could double as a judge's bench. Jack slid the van into park, checked the package label, and glanced toward the lobby. That was when he saw him. A boy sat curled in the far corner, knees pulled in, small hands tucked under his chin as if to keep the heat from leaking out of him. The lobby light cast shadows beneath his eyes, making the pallor of his skin starker. He wasn't dressed for the cold, just a thin jacket zipped unevenly, pants that had seen too many wash cycles, and sneakers darkened by damp. Jack lingered with his hand on the gear shift. Kids in lobbies weren't unusual in the city. Parents ran late. Babysitters stepped outside for a smoke. But this boy didn't fidget, didn't look toward the door as if expecting anyone. His gaze stayed fixed on the floor, eyelids heavy. Jack climbed out of the van and shouldered the package, rain running off the brim of his cap. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and new carpet. The receptionist, a young woman with hair scraped into a tight bun, didn't glance up from her phone until he cleared his throat. "Delivery for 9:22, he said, placing the package on the counter. She scribbled a signature without looking at the name. Jack nodded toward the boy. "That your neighbor's kid?" The receptionist followed his gaze, then shrugged. "Belongs to one of the residents. His mom's busy. Happens all the time." The words lodged into Jack's skin. "He's sick?" She gave a little huff, turning back to her phone. "He's fine, just tired." The boy shifted then, a faint sound escaping him, something between a cough and a whimper. Jack set the package aside and crossed the lobby. "Hey, bud," he said softly, crouching until he was level with the boy. "What's your name?" The boy's eyes lifted, unfocused, as if the effort cost him. "Leo." His voice was a thin rasp. "All right, Leo. You waiting for someone?" Leo's had made a vague motion. Yes or no, Jack couldn't tell. The boy swallowed, grimacing. "It hurts to breathe." A muscle jumped in Jack's jaw. He thought of Maisie last winter, pale as milk in the pediatric ward, the steady beep of monitors measuring each breath. He remembered the terror of waiting for a doctor to come through the door. "Where's your mom, Leo?" Leo's eyelids fluttered. "Work." Jack looked over his shoulder at the receptionist. She'd already returned to her phone, thumbs flicking fast. "All right," Jack murmured, moored himself in the boy. "We're not doing this." He slid his arms under Leo, feeling how little weight the child carried. Leo didn't resist. His head fell against Jack's shoulder with a heat that spoke of more than the room's warmth. "Hey, what are you doing?" the receptionist asked, finally straightening. "Getting him to a hospital," Jack said, already heading for the door. "You can't just—" "Watch me." Outside, the rain came harder, cold pinpricks against the back of his neck. Jack opened the van's passenger door, easing Leo onto the seat. He stripped off his jacket and draped it over the boy, tucking it in around his thin frame. The cracked glass wristwatch on Jack's arm caught the streetlight, the second hand ticking a little too fast in his ears. The engine roared to life. Jack kept one eye on the road, the other flicking toward Leo, whose breaths came shallow and slow. Each time he coughed, it was small but sharp, as if it scraped his ribs on the way out. "You hang on, buddy," Jack said, voice low. The city blurred past in streaks of red and white, rainwater chasing itself down the windshield. Jack cut through side streets, avoiding the clogged main avenue, tires hissing on the slick pavement. His mind ran faster than the van. Would he tell Maisie when he called? Whether the hospital would even treat a kid brought in by a stranger? How long it had been since Leo had eaten anything warm? At a red light, Jack glanced again. Leo's eyes were half closed, lashes dark against his skin. Jack tapped the glass of the watch face, as if to remind himself time was still moving, and pressed the accelerator when the light changed. The hospital rose from the rain like a slab of white stone, its windows throwing pale light into the night. Jack pulled into the drop-off lane, hopped out, and swung open the passenger door. Inside the ER, the air was thick with antiseptic and the faint copper tang of blood. A nurse at the intake desk looked up, her gaze sharpening when she saw Leo in Jack's arms. "What happened?" she asked, already reaching for a clipboard. "Found him in a lobby," Jack said. "Fever, trouble breathing. No parent in sight." The nurse nodded briskly and gestured toward a curtained bay. Another nurse took Leo from Jack, his jacket slipping to the floor. Jack bent to pick it up, rainwater dripping onto the tile. "Are you family?" the first nurse asked. Jack hesitated. "No, just someone who couldn't walk away." Her eyes softened, but only for a second. "You should wait. We'll need a statement." Jack sat in a molded plastic chair, the kind that forced you upright no matter how tired you were. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the grit of the day in his skin. Across the waiting room, a man in work overalls stared blankly at a muted TV. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped steadily. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed. Jack checked his phone. 3 missed calls from Maisie's neighbor. He sent a quick text, running late. "Tell Maisie I'll be home as soon as I can." A nurse returned, asking questions in a clipped but polite voice. Name, time found, any known medical history. Jack could answer only half of them. She nodded, made notes, and told him Leo was stable but needed monitoring. Jack stood, thinking this was a moment to leave. The boy was safe now, but as he turned toward the doors, a small voice came from behind him. "Don't go." He looked back. Leo lay in the bed, taped his hand, eyes glassy but fixed on Jack. The boy's fingers curled weakly, as if they closed around something if it were close enough. Jack crossed the room before he realized he'd moved. He pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat, resting his forearms on his knees. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Leo's eyelids lowered, the faintest relief in the set of his mouth. Outside, the rain hammered the roof in steady percussion, each drop marking time Jack didn't mind giving away. He glanced once at the watch, then stopped, letting the second hand run without him. He stayed there, listening to the boy's breathing even out, not yet knowing the name of the woman who would walk through the door tomorrow and change the rest of his days. Morning unfurled slowly over the city, the skyline drawing itself in pale strokes against a sky still smudged with night. In the corner office of the 43rd floor, Evelyn Ray sat behind a desk that could have doubled as a conference table, her posture straight, her hands wrapped around a porcelain cup of tea gone tepid. Glass walls surrounded her, giving the illusion of command over the sprawl of streets and rooftops below. She preferred it this way: distance, perspective, the insulation of height. Her phone vibrated once against the desk. She didn't check it immediately. The last few months had conditioned her to triage her attention. Emails before texts, texts before calls. Calls only if they were scheduled. The first sip of tea was halfway to her mouth when the phone lit again, this time with the hospital's name on the display. She answered without the practiced smile she used for clients. "Ms. Ray, your son was brought in last night. He's stable now, but you want to come in." Her chair scraped faintly as she stood. "Brought in? By who?" "A delivery driver, according to the intake nurse. He found Leo in your building lobby." The word lobby landed heavy, out of place in the sequence of her morning. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. The assistant in the outer office caught her eye as she passed, but Evelyn's clipped, reschedule the board call, allowed no questions. The hospital's corridors smelled of disinfectant and the faint sweetness of hand sanitizer. It was a scent Evelyn associated with things she couldn't control. She walked with a kind of speed that didn't break her composure, her heels clicking on the polished linoleum. Leo was in a room near the end of the hall, a small figure against the starch-white bedclothes. Beside him sat a man she didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, wearing a faded canvas jacket that looked out of place in these sterile surroundings. A book rested open in his hands, the pages softened from years of handling. The man's head lifted as she entered, his eyes, hazel with an edge she couldn't name, assessing her in a single glance. "You're his mother," he said, not a question. "Yes," she replied, moving to the foot of the bed. "And you are—" "Jack Halstead. I found him last night. He was alone." Her hand smoothed the blanket over Leo's legs, more for something to do than from need. "Thank you for bringing him here. I'll take it from here." Jack closed the book, but didn't move from his chair. He was having trouble breathing. The receptionist downstairs didn't seem to care. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She didn't need a stranger telling her about lapses in her building staff. "I'll address that." For a moment, neither spoke. Leo's breathing was softer now, steady in a way that made Evelyn's chest unclench. She brushed a hand over his hair. His eyelids flickered but didn't open. "You didn't have to stay," she said finally. Jack's gaze shifted to the boy, then back to her. "He asked me not to leave." There was no rebuttal for that, so she said nothing. The nurse stepped in with a clipboard, glancing between them. "Vitals are good. We'll keep him for observation a little longer, but he's doing better." She handed Evelyn a form, which Evelyn signed with a pen from her coat pocket, her signature crisp. When the nurse left, Evelyn turned to Jack. "Do you have children?" "A daughter, Maisie, 7. Something in the way he said the name, a softness not present anywhere else in his voice, made Evelyn glance at him more fully. His clothes smelled faintly of rain and engine oil, and there was a tiredness around his eyes that didn't come from a single bad night's sleep. "You must have had a long evening," she said, though the words felt inadequate. He shrugged, as if the weight of it wasn't worth remarking on. Kids don't choose when they need help. The line sat between them, unadorned, impossible to disagree with. Leo stirred then, a small sound escaping him. His eyes opened a fraction, finding Jack first. Evelyn noticed a faint twitch of his fingers toward the man, and something in her bristled, protective, but also oddly displaced. "Hey, buddy," Jack murmured, leaning slightly forward. "How you feeling?" Leo's answer was a breath more than a word. "Better." Evelyn smoothed the blanket again, forcing her voice steady. "You'll be home soon." Leo's gaze slid back to Jack, lingering as if to confirm that home wasn't just an address, but something that could follow him out of this room. Evelyn stepped back, giving space she didn't want to acknowledge was needed. Jack stood finally, the chair scraping faintly. "I'll let you two be." "Mr. Halstead," she said before she could stop herself. He paused in the doorway. "Thank you. Truly." He nodded once, the gesture small but solid, and was gone. Evelyn remained where she was, her hand resting on the bed rail. The rain had stopped outside, light shifting to the half-open blinds in pale stripes across Leo's blanket. She thought of the man's cracked glass watch, the way his voice had gentle when speaking to her son, and found herself wondering, not for the first time in a long while, what it might be like to have someone step in without being asked. The thought unsettled her enough that she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of Leo's breath, willing herself to believe that her presence here now could make up for her absence the night before. But the image of Jack Halstead leaving the room stayed with her, like the echo of a footstep you can still hear long after the hall has gone quiet. Leo's release from the hospital came 3 days later, bundled in the pale light of morning that threatened rain. Evelyn guided him through the lobby with a hand at his back, his small steps cautious. The doctor's orders had been clear. Rest, fluids, no school for at least a week. But Leo's voice had been quiet on the ride home, as if the words he wanted to say weren't ready to be spoken. By the second afternoon, Evelyn noticed a pattern. Whenever she left a room, Leo would crane his neck toward the door, a faint expectancy in his expression. When she finally asked what he was looking for, he only shrugged, but the answer arrived 2 hours later in the form of a hesitant knock. Jack Halstead stood there, his hair damp from the drizzle, holding a small paper bag. "Figured he might like these," he said, lifting the bag slightly. Inside were 3 children's books, their covers worn but clean. Evelyn considered telling him it wasn't necessary, but Leo's face had already shifted, subtle but undeniable. The boy's eyes lifted in a way she hadn't seen in days. She stepped aside. "Come in." Jack's presence filled the apartment differently than she expected. Less intrusion, more like a weight settling evenly across the floor. He knelt by Leo's armchair, letting the boy choose a book, and began reading without fanfare. Evelyn busied herself in the kitchen, but the low cadence of Jack's voice reached her anyway, even over the kettle's hiss. When the story ended, Leo leaned against the armrest, the color in his face a shade warmer. "Can he come back tomorrow?" Evelyn hesitated, glancing at Jack. His brows lifted slightly, waiting for her to decide. "We'll see," she said, though the part that measured risk had already begun adjusting the calculation. The next visit was no accident. She'd sent a short text. "He's asking about you. If you're free." Jack arrived with a small toolkit, saying something about a loose shelf he'd noticed in the living room. Evelyn watched as he tightened the screws with careful turns, each movement unhurried, deliberate. "You do this often?" she asked. "Fix things?" He glanced up briefly. "Only when they matter." Maisie came with him on the 3rd visit. She was a wisp of a girl with strawberry blonde hair and a sketchbook tucked under her arm. While Jack read to Leo, Maisie sat cross-legged on the rug, drawing shapes Evelyn couldn't decipher until she tilted the page. 2 children in a park, a man and a woman standing nearby. "That's you and my dad," Maisie said, as if the observation needed no filter. Evelyn felt a warmth rise beneath her collar and focused instead on the teacup in her hand. Small exchanges began to stitch themselves into the days, Evelyn slipping a container of soup into Jack's hands for Maisie, Jack leaving the repaired shelf sturdier than before. Leo collecting their moments in the quiet drawings he kept tucked in a drawer by his bed. One evening, rain traced lines down the living room windows while the 4 of them sat around the coffee table, building a puzzle Leo had insisted on starting. Jack's fingers were steady as he fitted the edge pieces, Maisie humming under her breath while Evelyn searched for corner tiles. It was the first time Evelyn realized the silence in her apartment no longer felt hollow. Later that week, over coffee in the kitchen, Jack spoke of his wife without the practiced economy of someone reciting facts. She got sick fast. One winter she was fine, the next she wasn't. "I think that's why He stopped, searching for the right end of the sentence. "Why you stayed with Leo that night," Evelyn finished. Jack nodded once. No one should be alone when they can't breathe. She told him, in return, about the years after her divorce, how she learned to balance shareholder meetings with school pickups, how she measured every new acquaintance against the fear of letting someone harm her son. Jack listened without interruption, the kind of listening that left space instead of filling it. On Saturday, they met at the park. The sky was overcast but dry, the grass damp from the morning's earlier drizzle. Leo and Maisie ran ahead, their laughter echoing off the playground's metal frames. Evelyn and Jack followed at a slower pace. "You always walk like that?" she asked. "Like what?" "As if you're keeping an eye on everything." He smiled faintly. Force of habit. They found a bench and sat, their shoulders angled just enough to avoid touching. The children darted from the slide to the swings, inventing games without rules. Evelyn found herself watching Jack as much as she watched Leo, how he leaned forward slightly whenever one of the kids climbed higher. The quick scan he made of the area before settling again. The first drops of rain came unexpectedly, tapping against the metal of the swings. Neither of them moved to leave. Jack glanced at her, and for a moment there was no sound but the soft drum of water on leaves and the distant laughter of the children. On Monday, in the polished glass of a boardroom, Evelyn caught fragments of her colleague's conversation. The delivery guy, seeing with her kid, she didn't correct him, but the words lingered like grit under her skin. That evening, she stood at her apartment window, the city lights reflecting faintly in the glass, and thought of the way Leo's hand fit naturally into Jack's without hesitation. By the week's end, she sent another text. Dinner here tomorrow? Maisie, too. Jack arrived on time, rain still glistening on his jacket. The meal was simple: roast chicken, green beans, bread warm from the oven, but the table felt fuller than it had in years. After the plates were cleared, Maisie and Leo sprawled on the rug with a board game, while Evelyn and Jack lingered in the kitchen over coffee. "You're different than I expected," she said. "How so?" "I thought you'd make me feel obligated, like I owed you something for helping Leo. And now," she took a slow sip before answering, "now it feels like you were just supposed to be there." Jack's gaze held hers for a moment too long, the faint curve of a smile at the corner of his mouth. When he left that night, Evelyn found herself at the window again, watching the street where his taillights blurred into the rain. She knew the line between gratitude and something else had begun to shift, but she didn't name it. Not yet. The rain continued through the night, steady and unbroken, as if it had more threads to weave before the pattern could be seen. The weather turned again in early March, a wind carrying the bite of winter even as the sidewalks darkened with rain. Evelyn was in the middle of reviewing a quarterly forecast when her phone lit with Leo's school number. His teacher's voice was apologetic but firm. Leo had a low fever, was pale, complained of feeling dizzy. Evelyn's mind leapt to that night in the lobby, the heat in his skin, the rasp in his voice. She was already standing when she said, "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Halfway to the door, she stopped, phone still warm in her hand. Without overthinking, she scrolled to a name she hadn't expected to use for this. "Jack," she said when he answered. "It's Leo. He's not well. Could you—" "I'm on my way," he cut in, no hesitation, as if her words were only confirmation of something he'd already decided. By the time she reached the school office, Jack was there, crouched beside Leo's chair, his hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. Leo leaned into him the way children lean into warmth they trust. Evelyn's throat tightened. They brought him home together, rain following him up the steps, the air between them filled with the quiet urgency of shared purpose. In the apartment, Jack helped Leo into bed while Evelyn fetched water and a cool cloth. They settled into a rhythm without speaking. She checked the thermometer, he adjusted the blankets, their movements threaded together by unspoken agreement. As night fell, Leo drifted into a restless sleep. Evelyn sat on one side of bed, Jack on the other, the dim lamplight flattening shadows across the room. Every so often their hands brushed when passing a glass of water or the damp cloth. Neither pulled away. "You didn't have to come," she murmured at one point. "Didn't I?" His eyes were steady, holding hers longer than was safe for someone who didn't want to be read. Evelyn looked back at Leo, tracing the soft rise and fall of his chest. "I'm not used to this. Someone staying without being asked." Jack leaned back slightly in the chair, the cracked glass watch catching a shard of lamplight. "Then maybe you should get used to it." Hours slipped by in the hush of the room. The rain outside tapped steadily against the window, a low percussion that made the silence inside feel gentler. Evelyn told him, in pieces, about the early years after her divorce, the night she'd sat in hospital chairs alone, the way she learned to compress her fear into the narrow spaces between tasks. Jack listened, his gaze never wandering. In return, he spoke of Maisie's first winter without her mother, how every cough had felt like a cliff's edge. Just before midnight, Leo stirred, eyes opening enough to find them both. His voice was faint but certain. "Thank you for taking care of me. I like when we're all together." The words landed without flourish, folding into the room like a blanket being tucked in. Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. When Leo settled back to sleep, she rose to refill the water glass. Jack followed her into the kitchen, where the only light came from the street lamp outside, casting the counters in a muted gold. She set the glass in the sink, but didn't turn away. "You've changed things," she said quietly. He frowned slightly. "I didn't mean to change anything that wasn't wanted." "It's not that," she said. I don't know how to fit this into the way I've been living." Jack stepped closer, not crowding her, but close enough that she could feel the heat from his damp jacket. "You don't have to fit it. You just let it be." They stood there for a moment, the rain softening to a murmur against the glass. Evelyn could feel the pull in the space between them, not sharp or hurried, but steady, as if it had been building quietly all along. She didn't name it. Neither did he. By dawn, Leo's fever had broken. They found themselves walking out together, the city washed clean in the early light. The rain began again, light enough to bead on their coats. At the curb, they paused. Jack glanced at her, and in that glance was the sum of every moment since the night he'd carried her son into the hospital. Trust hard-earned, something like affection, and the knowledge that neither of them was standing alone anymore. No words passed. They didn't need them. The look was enough. She turned toward her building, and he toward his van, but the distance felt temporary, like a pause in a conversation they were both willing to resume. Above them, the rain threaded the air in fine silver lines, unhurried, as if it too knew there was no need to rush what was already in motion. If this story touched you, subscribe or share where you're watching from. These stories matter.